The day my father officially disappeared from paper started like any other Tuesday. I was at my small kitchen table, laptop open, coffee cooling beside a half-eaten piece of toast. Outside my apartment window, the city hummed in the familiar way it always did, distant car horns, a scooter whining past, the soft murmur of people heading to work. It was the kind of ordinary morning that convinces you life is stable. Then my phone buzzed. "Ms. Winford. This is Robert Ellis from Green & Ellis," a male voice said when I answered. "Your father's probate file, there's been a development." My chest tightened. It had been 3 weeks since my father's funeral. 3 weeks of numbness, of moving through days like I was walking underwater. I rested my elbow on the table, suddenly cold. "What kind of development?" I asked. He hesitated, and in that pause, the quiet of my apartment turned heavy. "We've conducted a thorough search," he said. "Safes, files, digital records. As it stands, there is no valid will on file." I stared at the cracked line in my ceiling. "That's not possible," I said, keeping my voice low. "My father told me he updated his will last year. He even joked about it. He said, 'Elara, I'm not leaving you a mess to clean up.'" "I understand," Ellis replied gently. "But legally, the only will we had from 10 years ago was revoked. Without a new one, the estate will be treated as intestate." My stomach dipped. Intestate. No will. The word felt like a trap door under my feet. "What does that mean for the inheritance?" I asked, even though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "It means the estate will be distributed according to statutory rules," he said. "Given your father's marriage, primary rights fall to his spouse, Mrs. Cassandra Winford. You may receive a portion, but it will be significantly less than if the updated will existed." Cassandra. I pulled the phone away for a second, staring at her name on the invisible air between us. My stepmother. Polished, composed, calculating. The woman my father had married 5 years ago. The woman who, at the funeral, kept patting my shoulder with hands that smelled like expensive lotion and said, "We'll work everything out, dear. Your father loved us both." My father's study flashed in my memory, the shelves of books, the tidy desk, the framed photos of us on the seaside when I was 12. He was meticulous. He color-coded his files. He labeled everything. The idea that his updated will had simply vanished didn't fit. "Are you sure?" I whispered. "Is there anywhere else you haven't checked? A safety deposit box, a digital backup?" He was very particular. "We checked the safety deposit box," Ellis said. "Only older documents. No valid will. If something changes, we'll let you know, but I'm afraid, for now, this is how the court will view it." I thanked him mechanically and ended the call. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. The ticking of the clock above the fridge felt too sharp, too precise. I sat there, phone still in my hand, and thought of how my father had died suddenly in his sleep, with no time for last words, no chance to say, "The documents are here, Elara." My eyes drifted to the old framed photo propped on my sideboard. It was the same one that had hung in his study, my father in his navy sweater, arm around me on the pier, laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. The will was missing. But my father hadn't been careless. Something was wrong. And for the first time since he died, I felt something sharper than grief, a quiet, rising suspicion. The first time Cassandra walked into my father's life, she arrived wearing a white silk blouse and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was 24 then, immersed in my first job at a small marketing agency. My father had invited me to dinner at the house I grew up in. The house with the ivy creeping up the stone walls and the oak tree in the yard that I used to climb until my palms blistered. "Someone I'd like you to meet," he had said over the phone. At the table that night, Cassandra complimented everything: the food, the house, the antique clock in the hallway. She laughed at my father's stories in a way that felt rehearsed, perfectly timed. When she turned to me, her gaze lingered just a second too long, as if assessing. "You must be Elara," she'd said. "He talks about you all the time." Back then, I tried to believe her. Years later, sitting in that same dining room after my father's funeral, I felt the echo of that first evening, only now his chair was empty. The curtains were half drawn, and the late afternoon light painted long, tired shadows across the table. The lawyer's call still rang in my ears. Cassandra poured herself tea from the porcelain pot, the clink of the spoon against china grating on my nerves. "I heard from Ellis today," I said. My voice was calm, but my fingers tightened around the edge of my cup. "He says they couldn't find Dad's updated will." Her hand stilled for half a second, so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching her. "That's unfortunate," she said. "But you know your father. He could be a bit absent-minded. Maybe he never finished it." "He told me he signed it," I replied quietly. "Last spring. We talked about it in the garden, by the oak. He said he'd made sure the company's shares would be handled properly. That the house," I paused. "That I would always have a place here." Cassandra lifted the cup to her lips, eyes serene. "Memories can be tricky when we're grieving. I'm sure he meant well, whatever he planned." Her words were gentle. Her tone was soothing. But underneath, something coiled, tight and smug. Over the next week, fragments of the future crashed into me. Without the will, Cassandra would control almost everything: the house, the majority of my father's shares in Winford and Hale, his small but respectable design firm, and the savings he'd built over decades. I might receive a modest portion, enough to cover debts and keep me afloat, but nothing compared to what he'd always told me. "You've worked hard," he'd say. "The company will be in good hands one day, whether you run it or sell it. I just want you safe." Safe felt very far away now. I walked through the halls, each room feeling slightly more foreign. The study where he spent evenings reviewing blueprints. The living room where he fell asleep in front of old crime dramas. The kitchen where he taught me how to fry an egg without burning it. All of it, technically, would be hers. One night, as I passed the open study door, I heard low voices inside. I stopped, the soft carpet muffling my steps. "It's better this way," a man's voice whispered. It was Nathan, Cassandra's younger brother. He'd been hovering around since the funeral, helping with arrangements. "As long as she doesn't start digging," Cassandra replied. "The court will follow what's on record. Or what's not." My heart thudded once, painfully loud. I should have walked in. I should have demanded answers. Instead, I stood there, invisible in the dim hallway, staring at the faint strip of light under the door. They were talking about me. About my father's missing will. About the estate that was no longer a question of grief, but of power. I went back to my room that night with my chest tight and my mind racing. I realized that I wasn't just at risk of losing money or a house. I was about to lose the last solid piece of who I'd been, my father's daughter in more than just name. I didn't find the will by being clever. I found it because I couldn't sleep. It was past midnight when I got up from the guest bed, the house creaking softly around me. Outside, the sky was a dull, clouded gray, the kind of night that makes everything feel unfinished. I padded barefoot down the hallway, past the closed door of my father's old room, and stopped at the study. The door was slightly ajar. The faint scent of his cologne lingered, cedar, with something warm underneath. It felt like walking into a memory. The desk lamp cast a small pool of light on the wooden surface. I had already searched this room with Ellis last week: drawers, cabinets, the safe behind the painting. We found old contracts, tax records, older drafts of wills, but not the one from last spring. Tonight, I wasn't searching for documents. I just needed to feel close to him. I sat in his chair and let it roll slightly, the wheels sighing against the rug. My fingers drifted over the items on his desk, the pen set I'd given him for his birthday, the small brass paperweight shaped like a globe, the coaster with a faint coffee ring stained into it. My gaze lifted to the wall in front of me. There, hanging in its usual place, was the framed photo I'd grown up seeing, my father and me on the pier, waves behind us, his arm around my shoulder. It was identical to the copy in my apartment, but larger, the frame slightly more ornate. Tonight, the glass caught the lamplight and threw back a muted glow. I don't know why I stood up. Maybe it was the strange angle of the frame, a few millimeters off level. Maybe it was nothing logical at all, just grief guiding my hands. I stepped closer and adjusted it. The frame felt heavier than it should. A small frown tugged at my brow. I lifted it off the wall carefully. The nail scraped softly against the metal hanger. The back of the frame was covered in brown paper, sealed with tape along the edges. And there, near one corner, I saw it, a slightly different strip of tape, newer than the rest. The edge wasn't as perfectly straight. A slow, quiet pulse started in my ears. I set the frame gently on the desk and slid my fingernail under that strip. The tape peeled back with a soft hiss. My breath shortened. Underneath was a folded envelope, thin but firm, pressed flat against the backing. My hands trembled as I eased it out. It was simple, cream paper, my father's neat handwriting on the front. To be given to my daughter, Elara Winford, in the event of my death. The words blurred for a moment as my eyes filled. I sank into the chair, the envelope a fragile weight in my palms. I turned it over. The seal was unbroken. Someone had hidden it. Someone had taken what was meant for me and wedged it behind his smiling face, like a secret he never meant to keep. I broke the seal. Inside was a formal document, my father's last will and testament, dated 8 months before he died. His signature was at the bottom, precise, unmistakable. Witness signatures were neatly lined beneath. Attached with a small paperclip was a handwritten letter on his stationery. I set the will down carefully and unfolded the letter. My dear Elara, it began. His pen strokes were steady, confident, like he was sitting across from me, speaking slowly. If you're reading this, it means I wasn't able to tell you everything in person. The updated will should be with Mr. Ellis, but I wanted you to have a copy here, somewhere you would find it if anything went wrong. I have made provisions to ensure you receive the house, a substantial portion of the company's shares, and funds to give you freedom of choice. Cassandra is provided for as well, but I will not have you sidelined or dependent on anyone's kindness. My throat tightened. He knew. I trust people by nature, he wrote, but I have learned to also trust my instincts. If you are ever made to feel like your place in this family is negotiable, this document is my answer. It is not. Tears slipped down my cheeks, hot and soundless. At the bottom, beneath his signature, he'd added one last line. Remember, if truth is hidden, it's because someone fears what it will change. I stared at the frame lying on the desk, its empty center exposing the cardboard backing where my father's face had just been. Someone had known exactly what this envelope was. And they had hidden it anyway. By the time the sun rose, I had made 2 decisions. First, I would not confront Cassandra in a storm of accusation. She thrived on control, emotional chaos would only give her room to twist the narrative. Second, I would let the law speak for me. At 8 in the morning, I walked into the downtown office of a different lawyer, Marianne Cole, a probate specialist recommended by a colleague. The waiting room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Soft classical music played from speakers hidden somewhere in the ceiling. Marianne ushered me into her office, a calm space lined with neatly stacked files and a single potted plant by the window. She looked to be in her late 40s, her expression direct but kind. "How can I help you, Ms. Winford?" she asked. I placed the envelope on her desk like it was something alive. "I found this last night," I said. "Behind a photo of my father in his study." She put on glasses and examined the will first, then the letter. The only sound in the room was the faint rustle of pages and the distant hum of traffic. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This appears to be a valid, signed will," she said. "With witnesses, clearly dated after the previous one was revoked. And this letter, it establishes intent and context." "Ellis said there was no updated will on file," I murmured. "He checked everything. The safe, the deposit box. If this was here all along, then someone either failed to inform him or deliberately prevented the will from being found," Marianne finished, her tone even. "Hiding a will can be considered fraud. At minimum, it's grounds to contest the current probate process." My fingers curled against my knees. "I don't want a scandal," I said. "I don't want this to turn into some circus. I want what my father intended." "That's exactly what we'll ask the court to enforce," she replied. Quietly, but clearly. Over the next few days, Marianne moved with a calm efficiency that reminded me of my father reviewing blueprints. She contacted Ellis, who was visibly stunned when he saw the will and the letter, as if someone had pulled the rug out from under his tidy case file. "This changes everything," he said softly. "I swear to you, Ms. Winford, I had no idea." I believed him. The surprise in his face was too raw to fake. A petition was filed to admit the newly discovered will and to pause the current proceedings. Court dates were scheduled. Notices were sent to interested parties, including Cassandra. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse corridors smelled faintly of cleaning solution and coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I walked beside Marianne, my step steady, my father's letter folded in my bag like a second heartbeat. Inside the probate courtroom, the air was cool and dry. Wooden benches, scuffed from years of use, lined the room. Cassandra sat at the front with Nathan beside her. She wore a tailored black dress, her hair perfectly smoothed back, her expression composed. When I entered, her eyes flicked to me. For the first time, I saw a shadow of uncertainty there. The judge, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a measured gaze, called the case. Marianne presented the will, explaining how it had been discovered. She then submitted my father's letter as supporting evidence of intent. The room was quiet as the judge read. On the other side of the aisle, Cassandra's attorney rose, arguing that the document's late appearance was suspicious, that it required investigation. But the more he spoke, the more the judge's frown deepened. Hiding a testamentary document behind a photograph in the decedent's study is, in itself, highly concerning, the judge said eventually. Particularly when those with access to the premises stood to benefit from its absence. Cassandra shifted in her seat. Nathan stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Marianne's voice remained steady, never rising. "All my client is asking," she said, "is that the court honor the decedent's clearly documented wishes. This will is properly executed. His letter confirms his reasoning. Anything else would be a distortion of his intent." The judge took a breath, then nodded once. "Pending verification of signatures and witnesses, which I suspect will only confirm what is already evident, this court is inclined to admit the later will," she said. "Interim distribution based on intestacy is hereby stayed. We will proceed on the basis of the decedent's final testament." It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. There was no gasp, no outburst. Just the soft scratch of the clerk's pen and the shuffle of papers. But in that quiet, something fundamental shifted. Cassandra's carefully constructed future, a life built on my father's assets and my silence, had been interrupted by a piece of paper she thought she'd buried behind glass. As we left the courtroom, I didn't look back at her. I didn't need to. My revenge was not a spectacle, not a shouted confrontation. It was the simple, inevitable weight of my father's own words finally landing where they were meant to. It took another month for everything to settle. The signatures on the will were verified. The witnesses, a retired partner from my father's firm and his longtime assistant, confirmed the signing date and their presence. The judge formally admitted the will, and the estate began to shift into the shape my father had designed for it. One afternoon, Ellis called with the final outline. As per the will, he said, you are to receive the house, the majority of the company's shares, and a substantial portion of the liquid assets. Mrs. Winford will retain the vacation property and a fixed financial provision. It's quite fair, actually. Balanced. My fingers traced the grain of the wooden banister as I stood in the hallway of the house that was now legally mine. That sounds like him, I murmured. He never wanted anyone to be left with nothing. He just didn't want me erased. Precisely, Ellis replied. There were whispers, of course. Quiet gossip among relatives and old family friends. Some said Cassandra had been careless, others that she had overplayed her hand. No one said it loudly enough to be quoted, but I saw the way her eyes slid away when she entered a room. She moved out a few weeks after the court's final decision, leaving behind an almost eerie neatness. Her perfume no longer lingered in the air, and the house seemed to exhale, like it had been holding its breath. We didn't have another confrontation. There was no dramatic apology. The closest we came was the day she came to collect the last of her things. She stood in the foyer, fingers wrapped around the handle of a small suitcase. Sunlight filtered through the glass panels of the front door, casting pale shapes on the floor between us. I hope you're satisfied, she said quietly. Her voice was smooth, but there was a crack at the edges. I met her eyes, feeling the old urge to soften, to reassure. But I thought of my father's letter, of the taped envelope behind the frame. I'm not satisfied, I replied. I'm aligned with the truth. That's all. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, something almost like regret flickered in her gaze. He always favored you, she said. Even when he pretended otherwise. He loved both of us, I said. The difference is, I never tried to make him choose. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked out, her heels tapping softly against the floor until the sound disappeared. After she left, I went to the study. The room felt different now, less like a museum and more like a place that needed to be lived in again. I opened the drawer where I'd placed my father's will and letter, both now scanned, filed, and backed up in 3 locations. The originals were wrapped carefully in archival sleeves. But it wasn't the documents I reached for. It was the photo. I'd had it reframed. This time, no hidden compartments, no taped-on secrets. Just the image of my father and me on the pier, the wind in our hair, his laughter caught forever in a single moment. I hung it back on the wall. For a long time, I stood there in the quiet, listening to the faint ticking of the clock, the distant hum of traffic beyond the garden, the soft creak of the house settling into its new reality. I thought about what I'd almost lost, not just a house or shares or money, but the narrative of who my father had been. If the will had stayed hidden, the story would have become, he left everything to his wife and almost nothing to his daughter. People would have nodded and said, well, that's how it goes sometimes. Instead, the truth had emerged, not through anger, but through persistence and a sliver of tape that didn't quite match. In the months that followed, I began to reshape my life. I took a more active role in Winford and Hale, not because I had to, but because I wanted to honor the work my father had poured himself into. I refurbished the house room by room, keeping his study much the same, only lighter, thinner curtains, a new rug, a plant near the window that turned toward the sun. On a quiet evening, as rain tapped gently against the glass, I sat at his desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. I wrote a short note and folded it. To my future self, it began. If you are ever tempted to stay silent to keep the peace, remember, peace built on someone else's lie isn't peace at all. I didn't hide it. I slid it into a small box on the shelf labeled personal, where anyone could find it if they bothered to look. My father's letter stayed where it belonged, filed, protected, unburied. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at the frame, remembering the weight of it in my hands that night. The moment my world tilted, not from loss, but from revelation. I still miss him. Grief doesn't dissolve just because justice shows up. But now, when I walk through this house, when I sit in this study, I feel something steadier at my core. I am not the daughter who was almost written out. I am the daughter who found the truth, behind the glass, behind the smile, and quietly, firmly, took my place back.